2024 was a fine year for movies, not as good as 2022 or 2023 in my opinion, and I think a lot of that is due to the strikes in 2023 that halted a lot of production on films, but plenty of good movies still came out, although plenty of bad ones did too. So without further ado, here are my top 20 favorite films of 2024.
Hey, stop! Stop! I'm a bear! Take it easy, hey! I'm a bear!
Dress Positions is an indie comedy following a group of queer friends dealing with intense interpersonal turmoil during a period of extreme societal isolation, the summer of 2020. I could be talking out of my ass here, but I believe this is the first pandemic-era comedy that wasn't itself shot during the pandemic, and as the first entry in what I assume will be a bigger subgenre in the coming years and decades, Dress Positions is a very worthy entry. It's a very well-constructed film from a narrative perspective. It has a very sprawling narrative with a lot of interlocking stories and characters that all coalesce at a certain point in a very chaotic but still very hilarious sequence. Despite how much is going on in this film, it's still very short at only 90 minutes, and the film has a very brisk pace that keeps everything moving without feeling rushed. The narrative is constantly developing in at least one of the characters and their stories, and speaking of the characters, I really love every single one of them. They're all very distinct and have their own personalities and backstories, and managed to feel very developed. The movie's really a masterclass on how to fit so much character and story development into such a tight runtime, and it makes complete use of its runtime in a way few other films today do. The world of this movie feels so large and developed as well. It exists far beyond the confines of the film. When the movie ends, it really feels like this was just one moment, one brief chapter in a very sprawling story of these people's lives, that this story will keep going on and on. It feels so real, like this is a genuine snapshot in time for these people. It's also just a great example of how to make use of limited locations to masterful effect. There are so few sets in this film, but you never get bored of them, as the movie constantly finds new and exciting ways to reinvent and shoot them. It's also a movie that has a lot of really interesting things to say about identity, sexuality, religion, and the idea of our likeness being packaged and sold as a commodity, and specifically how the pandemic both helped and hindered all of those things. It's a fantastic and very underrated little comedy that I'm certain will grow to be a cult classic over time.
Hood words by the Nazi child, masturbating in the back.
Luca Guadagnino is a filmmaker who's had an incredible year this year, with one really huge movie coming out, and another movie that didn't do quite as well, but that still is very, very impressive. And spoilers, both will be on this list, and we'll get to the bigger of the two eventually, but first we need to talk about Queer. Based on the William S. Burroughs novel of the same name, Queer is a surrealist homoerotic drama following an American expat played by Daniel Craig living in 1950s Mexico City. While there, he involves himself in many one-night stands with young men living in Mexico City until he meets a mysterious young guy who he soon becomes infatuated with. The beginning of this movie is pretty typical from what you would expect of a movie of this nature. It's a little repetitive, but the world and the characters and the atmosphere it crafts are really so interesting and engaging that you can't help but get sucked into it. The performances are really incredible as well. Daniel Craig, of course, gives a fantastic and intoxicating performance as this very strange and unusual man, but even the supporting performances are great too. Drew Starkey is great as Daniel Craig's character's lover, and Jason Schwartzman gives an almost unrecognizable performance as one of Daniel Craig's character's close friends. As the movie goes on, it gets increasingly strange and surreal, not to say there isn't a level of surrealism from the start, but it becomes particularly recognizable as the film goes on. It's really unlike anything I've seen this year with just how bizarre it can get, which is part of the reason for the title. I mean, Queer, of course, alludes to the homosexual nature of this film, but it also alludes to its inherent peculiarness. It's an incredibly queer film in many ways. And Luca Guadagnino has time and time again proven himself to be a very creative and versatile filmmaker, and that's been especially true this year with such a stark variation between the two films he's created.
I'm overboard. Shut the fuck up during the movie.
Radu Jude is a Romanian filmmaker who's delivered some pretty weird, unique, and interesting films over the past decade or so. His previous film, Bad Luck Banging or Looney Porn from 2021, didn't do much for me, but his latest film, Do Not Expect Too Much from the End of the World, definitely subverted my expectations and really impressed me with its incredibly biting social commentary, presented in such an eccentric and strange package. The movie follows a young woman named Angela whose day job is at a video production company, currently casting for a safety PSA video for an Austrian company. When she isn't working, she's focused on her TikTok videos, which we see her using a filter to play a caricature of an Andrew Tate-esque figure that constantly goes on strange and crude, politically incorrect, misogynistic rants. This creates two separate worlds for our character to inhabit: her incredibly stressful and depressingly bleak reality, and the fantasy she creates through her videos. The movie is very steeped in current culture and just pop culture in general, with the entirety of the film being loaded with numerous references and allusions to world events, public figures, and other media. Radu Jude even intersperses the current day narrative of Angela driving around Romania frantically, trying to cast a safety video with footage of the 1981 Romanian film named Angela Goes On, and the parallel between the two works are very clear. Despite all the changes that has happened in the country, the cold and bleak atmosphere still remains largely the same. In the final act, the film switches formats to showcase the shooting of the safety video, and the entire sequence is shown in one still, unbroken shot. It really gets to the core of the issue of blatant exploitation of the Romanian public that this movie seeks to showcase through its allusions to figures like Andrew Tate, its juxtaposition of modern Romanian working life with that of the 1980s, and finally, most plainly, through an unbroken 30-minute long shot of a Romanian man whose story is turned into nothing more than homogenous corporate slop. It's an incredibly dark but very funny satirical comedy from one of the most unique and singular artists working today. Definitely check this out if it sounds at all appealing to you, and while you're at it, check out some of his earlier films as well.
What's up, baby girl?
Baby Girl is a new film by Bodies director Helena Rain. I really enjoyed that movie for its humorous and satirical nature, and its very fun, stylized visuals. Baby Girl is a very different type of movie too. Bodies being an erotic romantic drama starring Nicole Kidman and Harrison Dickinson. Some have described it as an erotic thriller, and while I don't necessarily think it fits the description entirely, it still is a very thrilling movie to watch. It's a film that follows a female CEO of a powerful tech company who begins an illicit affair with a younger male intern. It's a very interesting subversion and deconstruction of power dynamics and gender dynamics in relationships, and despite the control Rami obviously has over the situation given her position, she still fetishes the idea of being powerless and even losing power to an extent. And despite her assertions that she is proud of the life and family she's built up and does not want to lose them, she puts them on the line in her quest for submission. And the movie itself isn't just a surface level erotic romance, though it goes far deeper than that and is very interested in exploring the reasons for why this fantasy exists inside Rami, why the concept of being powerless is something that turns her on. If somehow, despite everything she has done to be seen as a strong, intelligent woman, she still herself doesn't feel worthy of being in that position of power. In fact, despite the illusion of this fantasy being that she's powerless, truthfully, she's always in complete control, and Samuel is in fact the one who is powerless in this situation. It's really such an intoxicating dynamic these characters have, because there's this harsh divide between reality and fantasy, and it's once those lines start to become blurred that things begin to fall apart. It's really interesting and thrilling film that is extremely interested in not only crafting a very horny and sexy erotic film, but also in breaking down and completely inverting the common dynamics that exist within these type of films. It's a very well written and constructed movie that is absolutely carried by its performances, both leading and supporting. So definitely check this one out if it sounds at all interesting to you. Brady Corbet is a filmmaker whose work I've struggled to connect with in the past. This is why when I heard that he had a 3.5 hour long epic that sought to touch on a lot of really heavy concepts and themes about immigrant life in post-war America, as well as, the whole idea of the American dream, I was worried that it too would come off as equally vapid and pretentious. However, I find that The Brutalist, this movie, manages to back up what it has to say pretty well, and I think all the choices it makes, while often avant-garde and pretentious, generally feel pretty meaningful and purposeful to the themes and concepts present within the film. The movie follows an accomplished Jewish-Hungarian architect played by actor Adrien Brody. His movie really brings a lot of heart and soul to the film, which is something I felt was missing in Corbet's previous movie. He clearly cares about the people he's surrounded by and the art he creates. And the movie tackles a lot of themes, but one it tackles heavily is the passion and the pursuit to create art. In this case, the art of architecture. Architecture is something you don't really see a whole lot of movies approach or talk about as an art form, so, I really loved how this movie got into the artistry of it. I expected this movie to be a lot more sprawling, but it's very restrained, very focused in its setting, and it sets its sight in particular on one specific era of a man's life, when he first moves to the States and gets contracted by a rather eccentric and wealthy man to create this community center for this, small Pennsylvanian town. And, it does manage to make this very massive film quite engaging to watch. It's not fast-paced, but it does have this really incredible energy about it that keeps things moving and keeps you invested and interested. The visuals of this movie are also just so beautiful. It just looks and feels epic. In terms of its scale, it feels like a big budget film, with how monumental of a feat it is, but truthfully, it's just a little $10 million indie film. It does not feel like that at all while watching, which just adds to the incredibly impressive nature of this movie. Despite this movie containing no dialogue whatsoever and being completely animated with free-to-use software, Blender, Flow is one of the most touching and emotionally moving movies of the year so far. It's an incredibly beautifully animated film despite how unusual its style is. It looks almost like a PS3, Xbox 360 era video game cutscene, but don't let that fool you into thinking that the animals in this movie can't be incredibly expressive and distinct. Each character has very unique and clearly defined personalities that shine through so well despite the lack of dialogue in the film. Many of these characters even undergo emotional arcs by the end, which is just so incredibly impressive. The story itself is relatively simple, following a world populated by animals that experiences a biblical level flood and the measures the animals go to ensure their survival. We follow one particular ragtag gang of animals as they navigate the treacherous flooded landscape. I was afraid this movie was going to get stale or old after a while due to just how little I expected they could do with this subject matter, but despite my worries, the film really proved me wrong and maintained an incredibly infectious energy over its 90-minute runtime. A lot of this is due to just how strong these characters are and how much you grow to love them and care about them throughout the film. The movie even managed to be really emotional at points and made me cry on multiple occasions, which is not something I do all that often during films. This movie is really a testament to how you can make a lot with a little and the power that just images can have without dialogue or any hard and fast story. The story of this film is very loose and kind of aimless. There's no point A to point B type narrative, no climax and resolution. It's a very cathartic feeling to see such a small indie film from Latvia, of all places, get this industry recognition, especially one that was made, pretty cheaply and was completely just a passion project for the people involved. So definitely check it out. A Different Man is a movie by Aaron Schimberg. It's his second film, and like his first film, Chained for Life, it stars British actor Adam Pearson. Both Aaron Schimberg's films thus far deal with themes of deformities and disfigurements and how that affects people in their everyday lives. A Different Man is no different, although the way it approaches these themes is incredibly interesting as it uses an extremely original and completely unique narrative to explore these ideas. The movie follows Sebastian Stan as a man with a similar deformity to Adam Pearson, who lets it affect his life and demeanor. He's very self-conscious and very socially awkward, and he forms a relationship with his next-door neighbor, Ingrid, and wants to pursue a romantic relationship with her, but he sees it as impossible due to his deformity. Edward is the type of character we see a lot in movies like these. He's extremely reserved and shy and finds it hard to form relationships with anyone else. This movie completely flips this concept on its head when Edward discovers a miracle cure for his deformity and fakes his own death, taking on a new persona. He's now much more confident and excels at life more easily. But this quickly comes crashing down when he meets Oswald, played by Adam Pearson, who's far more confident and more personable than he ever managed to be, even now, despite having the same deformity he had. Not only this, but Oswald also starts a relationship with the same woman he had a crush on before he underwent his transformation. Oswald is now performing in a stage production that she wrote about Edward's life while she knew him. He realizes now that everything in his life that's held him back is almost been entirely of his own creation. It's a very tragic but also a very darkly comedic movie that really does not pull its punches whatsoever and fully commits to the bit, so to say. The performances are all around incredible, but Sebastian Stan especially gives one of the most interesting performances of the year as this man who's done so much to try and improve his life and is now seeing it all very quickly get ripped away from him. It's almost cruel with how it treats this character, but it's also a very poignant reminder of the things in life that hold us back and tear us down, and how they're most often ourselves. It's a very interesting rumination on the idea that no matter how much we try to change our lives or improve our standing socially, we can't change who we are. We will always be the same deep down, no matter what we look like on the outside.
Never been in jail before, and I'm really scared because I don't know who these people are.
Sing Sing is a drama film based on a true story about a man at Sing Sing Correctional Facility in New York who is falsely convicted of the crime he did not commit. In the film, this character is played by someone who I consider to be one of the best actors working today, Colman Domingo, and unsurprisingly, he gives an absolutely incredible performance here. This character is so hopeful and still keeps his head up despite the hardships he has to face. He escapes from the everyday horrors of his world through his participation in the prison's theater program. All the people in this film feel so real and genuine, which is mostly due to the fact that the characters are themselves played by the real inmates that the story itself is based on. It adds a really interesting level of authenticity to the film that really manages to elevate it to new heights. It's also a really big feat that all of these non-professional actors are able to blend in so well with Colman Domingo here. You know, this director is one who I'm not familiar with, but after watching the film, I do find myself really loving his style and looking forward to seeing more from him. It's not super flashy or intrusive, but that's the perfect thing for this story, as it allows all of these performances to really shine on their own merits. It's a powerful and beautiful film that has such a strong emotional core.
You shout like that, they put you in jail. Right away. No trial, no nothing.
Seed of the Sacred Fig is a family drama that morphs into a really tense thriller and almost a horror film of some sort by the end by an Iranian director, Mohammad Rasulov, who's previously been imprisoned and persecuted by the Iranian government for his films, with this film being no different. In fact, he and other members of his crew were sent into exile for their work on the film, and it's no surprise given how critical this movie is of the Iranian regime at this core. It's a movie about how the oppressive governments not only affect life in public and the culture of the country, but how this seeps into the home life and how it can destroy families. The first two acts showcase a very engaging and compelling family drama, showing a family starkly divided between the parents who are in staunch support and even work for the ruling regime, and the children who are vehemently against it. You understand each member of this family's perspective, even when you actively disagree with them from a fundamental standpoint. The movie does a great job at explaining and showcasing what causes people to believe the things they do and act the ways that they do. The husband in this movie is really dangerous and a pretty terrifying force, but it's clear why he's this way. He even has been conditioned by the government he works for to be incredibly paranoid and terrified of everything and everyone. The same goes for the wife, who has been conditioned throughout her life to be incredibly submissive and always given to her husband, and the autocratic forces of the government. The children in this family, however, have views that are being reshaped and reformed into fighting for personal freedoms and not putting up with the external forces controlling their lives and telling them what to do. And it's a very tense and suspenseful film that builds and builds until we reach the harrowing and explosive final act where the mask completely comes off and the true evil that lies beneath these oppressive forces finally reveal themselves. It's a fantastic movie that's extremely powerful and relevant today, both inside and outside of Iran as well.
It was perfect. Perfect.
Wim Wenders is the director of one of my favorite movies of all time, so when I heard he was coming out with a new film, I was understandably hyped to check it out. I do have to say, it did live up to my hype, although it also subverted a lot of my expectations as well. Perfect Days is a movie that follows a toilet cleaner in Tokyo. It's very subtle and very quaint as a movie. Not a whole lot really happens, but it's not about any extreme plot development. Instead, it's simply a movie about seeing the beauty in the world around you. Our main character's life isn't perfect, not by any means, but he has no complaints with his life. He's in love with the world and is entirely happy and satisfied. He's found something he likes doing, and even though some people may see it as monotonous or as a less than stellar job, he's found beauty in his routine. It's an extremely beautiful movie about how it's the small things in life that matter most. And the cinematography here is incredible as well and really captures this location so well. Wim Wenders is really great at capturing the world around him no matter what location he's in. And the acting here is fantastic too. Koji Yakusho is really such an legendary actor who gives a legendary performance here. This one came out early in the year and definitely flew under the radar a bit, so give it a watch now if you didn't get a chance to when it came out.
Some kids like to play, others just sort of wait for adulthood.
Problemista is a surreal indie comedy by former SNL writer and comedian Julio Torres. It's a very absurdist take on modern-day New York City, incorporating the strange and whimsical style Torres is known for into this amazing metaphor for the modern-day American dream. Immigrants coming to this country to chase aspirations of success in their art and gain recognition for the work that they create. It's a very beautiful and heart-wrenching story that has some really powerful performances at the center, both from Torres himself, also from Tilda Swinton, who is fantastic as ever here. She perfectly immerses herself into this world and really becomes a part of it. They really just form such a fantastic duo together and have such an incredible chemistry. It's really very strange as a film, but one that has a lot of heart. The ending is also incredibly emotional and very beautiful.
He poisoned our water supply, burned our crops, and delivered a plague unto our houses! He did? No!
One of my favorite films of 2021 was Ryusuke Hamaguchi's 3-hour-long drama Drive My Car. His newest film, Evil Does Not Exist, is much shorter and much quainter, but just as good. It all takes place in this small Japanese village that is under the threat of a large company building a glamping compound. The movie's mostly about the culture shock between two big cities executives from the company and a local odd job man who helps out around the village. Throughout the film, these two executives from the company come to the village to try and ease tensions in the town, and at first they don't understand the locals, but they soon come to side with them over the company. The movie is extremely reserved and small scale as a movie, but it makes use of its characters and locales completely. It's a very aesthetically pleasing film too, with some really beautiful cinematography throughout. It might not be super satisfying from a narrative point of view. Now, the story about the glamping project very much just fizzles out and is forgotten by the end, but it still somehow works here because the movie never pretends it's what the film's about, because it isn't about that at all. No matter what people try to do to claim this land as their own, it still is Mother Nature territory at the end of the day. It's a fantastic and underrated film from one of the most overlooked filmmakers working today, and one that I wholeheartedly recommend. Okay, so we've made it to the other Luca Guadagnino film released this year, and by far the more popular one. The film follows Zendaya, Mike Faced, and Josh O'Connor, who are all in a love triangle threesome type of scenario. They have such an incredible chemistry, and each play off of each other so well. All their performances are fantastic, but especially Zendaya, who plays this really interesting and very intense character that's also really controlling and manipulative, but in such a subtle way. The layers and the depth to her performance really deserve to be talked about. It's probably, no, definitely her best performance to date. The movie's also a tennis movie, but not really in the way you would expect a sports film to be about a sport. I mean, it's definitely about the sport, and the movie is so focused on the sport itself. I mean, it constantly cuts back to this one tennis match, which is the centerpiece of this movie. And the way the movie shoots the sport is just so interesting and dynamic. You know, it's so intense and pretty erotic too. The structure of this film is honestly one of the most interesting things about it. It's very free-flowing and fluid, jumping around between time and place with no real care. It's super interesting and engaging with how the plot of the film's laid out. It also seems like it's the type of thing that would be confusing or hard to follow, but Honestly, it's all very intuitive. The writing of this film is really magnificent in that regard, and the dialogue's great too. There are so many layers behind every single thing these characters say and do. The cinematography is also really insane. The tennis sequences especially really define new ways to showcase sports action in movies. The editing does a lot of the heavy lifting, especially during the climactic final sequence. The movie's been getting a bunch of rave reviews and really has a rabid fan base, and it's no surprise why. It's an incredible feat of filmmaking on all fronts, and you've probably seen it by now, but if for some reason you haven't, check it out. Like, what are you doing? It's so good.
Step into my candy store.
Sean Baker is a filmmaker I've not at all been shy of expressing my admiration for in the past. In my recent Palme d'Or video, you can hear my exclamations of excitement when I learned his most recent film, Anora, has won the top prize.
Goes to Anora.
Yes! And as far as his filmography goes, I don't find it to be as good as Red Rocket or The Florida Project, but it also isn't trying to be like either one of those films. Time and time again, Sean Baker has shown how versatile he is as a filmmaker. He is always so interested in following people from walks of life that are generally overlooked by society at large. But the form it takes here is perhaps his most humorous and also the most stressful he's gotten since his breakout success in 2015 with Tangerine. Not to imply that the more comedic tone causes the film to lose its heart or even its edge. In fact, the emotional heights this movie gets to are some of the most intense of Baker's whole filmography, save for maybe the ending of The Florida Project. It's a very fun and wild ride of a movie, but one that also knows when to reel it in and take a moment to just sit and stew with these characters and fully process everything they've gone through. The character being studied in this film is the titular Anora, a Brooklyn-born stripper played masterfully by Mikey Madison, who gives such an intense and powerful performance, completely immersing herself in this role in the world that this character resides in. A world that's perhaps just as important to the film as the characters themselves, given how much we see of it throughout the movie. It isn't just New York City we see in this film either. In a first for Baker, we actually leave our central location in the film. The central character's aspirations of leaving their upbringing behind and achieving great success comes to fruition here. Anora gets to leave Brooklyn, and she gets to live the rich life. She gets to have a happily ever after. The Cinderella story that starts with the happy ending, before dissolving into complete chaos and disorder. It's a very interesting subversion of Sean Baker's usual formula, but also of the usual formula of these types of movies in general. Despite the extreme tonal shift this film has, it still manages to feel incredibly cohesive. On paper, it might seem like it would be disjointed to go from like Cinderella story romance to slapstick comedy to hyper realistic, depressing drama, but in practice the story is written and constructed in such a way that allows it to all come together by the end. It's definitely Baker's most grand and sprawling vision compared to his usual more small scale and reserved work, and it may not be my favorite of his films, but it's undoubtedly his biggest movie to date in terms of both scale and reception, so definitely check it out if you haven't already. Janet Planet is a movie that seems very quaint and humble on the surface because it is in fact a very quaint and humble movie. It's a small-scale, quirky little indie coming-of-age story about a young girl and her unconventional relationship with her mother in early 1990s rural Massachusetts. It's a type of story that wouldn't seem overly revolutionary on the surface. It really seems like it would be like so many other movies like it. But Annie Baker presents such a unique and very singular vision of what it's like to be a kid that doesn't fit in with anyone else. A kid who's completely lost in their own world. A world that ultimately revolves around their mother. It's a movie about this very specific and widely forgotten period of growing up where you're torn between your oncoming adolescence and the societal expectation of individuality while still trying to hold on to your early childhood and maintain the status quo of being dependent on your parents. The performances in this film really capture these characters so well and really create this intoxicating dynamic that carries the whole movie. Zoe Ziegler as Lacey is really just incredible here, doing a lot of the heavy lifting while being so young. It's possibly the best child performance in any movie I've seen, and it really deserves more attention than it's getting. It's so intense and powerful, but in a very stripped back and subtle way. It feels so real and genuine in a way that's hard to capture. We as the audience are meant to fully understand Lacey and get in her head while she watches and absorbs her mother's life and actions. It's a movie told through the eyes of a child, and it takes this very vague and seemingly innocuous concept to unimaginable heights. It does this through its magnificent storytelling, but also through its cinematography. It's such a warm and cozy looking and feeling movie. It really is the kind of thing that induces this primal nostalgic feeling, and I don't mean nostalgia in the pandering consumeristic sense, I mean it in the actual sense of the word. imagery that invokes the feeling of the past, not referencing it directly in a shameless fashion, but creating a world that just completely encapsulates how it feels to be a kid. And for a debut feature, this is really insane for just how much it manages to do with so little. It's not grand or boisterous, it's just a little indie movie, but it's one that manages to be one of the most powerful experiences I've seen all year.
That motherfucker back there is not real!
With only a 6-month gap between this and Poor Things, it's really crazy how consistently innovative and insane Yorgos has been and still manages to be. Kinds of Kindness. It's an anthology with 3 different segments, each one touching on a different theme and idea. It is his largest movie in scale, but in other ways it's a return to form of sorts. Its settings are less extravagant than his previous 2 movies, and unlike those movies, it's not a period piece. It takes place entirely in the modern day. Its story is also somewhat more grounded than Poor Things is. Not to say it doesn't have the dark surrealism Yorgos has been known for from the very beginning, but the world of the movie is not fantastical in the same way Poor Things is. It's also a return to form in just how dark and nasty and cruel the movie is. Poor Things is a movie that is far more overtly sexual and at times nasty than other Hollywood movies created today are, but it doesn't have that same edge. It doesn't stoop to the same level of utter depravity that Lanthimos' earliest works do. This movie rectifies that, becoming quite possibly Yorgos' most depraved works today. The performances especially are a strong point in the film, given the sheer amount of range the actors here have to possess in this film due to the inherent structure of this film requiring them to portray 3 characters. In this anthology film, every segment stars the same actors playing different characters. It might seem like it would grow old or stale after a while to be watching the same performers over and over again, but these actors are really able to fully embody their roles in such distinct ways. Emma Stone and Jesse Plemons especially take the brunt of the work here, given that they're the leads in almost every segment. It's definitely not for the faint of heart, and is a film that is not at all aimed at general audiences, which surprised me given that it got a pretty wide release in the summer. I guess Yorgos used his more mainstream clout to create a grand scale and epic movie targeted at the freaks who have been longing for another Dogtooth era Yorgos film. I guess we should all thank him, and I can only guess what direction Yorgos will go in next in his upcoming science fiction film Begonia, but given everything he's done thus far, I can only anticipate that it will be spectacular. One of my favorite movies of 2021 was Titan. I've been waiting eagerly for Julia Ducournau's follow-up to that film, and it seems like I'll have to wait for a little bit longer. However, another French woman emerged this year with an absolutely delectable film to tide me over in the feminist body horror genre. That film is none other than The Substance by filmmaker Coralie Farge. It's one of the most inventive and creative films of the year, and also one of the most viscerally disgusting films of the year, which is strange given how much the awards bodies are flocking to it. This is a type of movie the Academy would usually stay far, far, far away from. This year, it's looking to be the frontrunner in one particular category, Best Actress. That actress is Demi Moore, who gives a career-defining performance here in a very bold move from an actor that many haven't thought about for a long while. Demi's performance still has plenty of grounded and tender moments throughout that really give the movie the sheer power and relatability it has. It's a movie about the predatory entertainment industry and the way that female performers especially are used and disposed of by the system, treated as objects meant to be played with and ogled at until the next big thing inevitably comes around. It's a movie about self-hatred and body dysmorphia and how people often are their own worst critics and seek to constantly improve and better themselves to a ridiculous degree. How eventually you reach this point of no return with that pursuit of betterment. It's really showcased in such a surreal and extreme way that really pushes a lot of boundaries in terms of just how far you can go to drive your point home. There are moments here, especially at the end of the film, that some might say go too far, where the movie goes too extreme with it, but I completely disagree. The movie uses its insanity to show just how absurd the standards of society are. It's a powerful, ridiculous, nasty, and very, very bloody horror movie that has proven to be a huge success both among fans of body horror, but also with society at large. It might be on the nose, but I think that's why it's captured the cultural consciousness this year. It contextualizes and presents the very feelings that permeate our modern culture. A reaction to the decades of unrealistic beauty standards and expectations of conformity that still exist today. It might be in your face, but it never talks down to its audience. It levels with them and shows them exactly what they want and need to see.
I'm the biggest bird. I'm the biggest bird.
Andrea Arnold is a filmmaker who makes movies that I really enjoy, but none have fully clicked with me before. That cannot be said about her newest film, which sadly has been really overlooked this year, which sucks given just how good it is. Bird is a movie that touches on a lot of the same themes and ideas as American Honey, but in a much more streamlined and effective way. The movie follows a young girl named Bailey who lives in impoverished conditions with her father, brother, and soon-to-be stepmother and stepsister. She is currently going through a very intense and tumultuous period in her young life where everything seems to be changing both internally and externally, and she's simultaneously having to experience some of the worst years of female adolescence while struggling to adapt to her new life with her father's new fiancé and overcome everyday struggles of the world she lives in. The film touches on a lot of pretty intense themes such as teen pregnancy and domestic abuse, but does so in such a tender and really thoughtful way. It never uses its more disturbing plot points for shock value and really gives all of them the attention that they care and deserve, still managing to juggle them with everything else going on in the film. It really does cover a lot of ground despite how quaint it may seem on the surface, and it really does so in a very tight manner without feeling like it's rushing through anything. The supporting cast of her younger siblings who live with her mom are really great too, even though they're even younger than she is. Some of them are toddlers almost, and while they don't get a lot of screen time, they really all have this very powerful and very beautiful, feeling to them, and Andrea Arnold really knows how to direct these young performers and get really great performances out of them. The most notable performance here, though, comes from Franz Rogowski, who really has proven to be a very good actor in the very little of his body of work I've seen. Here he portrays the character of Bird, the titular character, who is this very strange and quite mysterious character who Bailey comes to form a very close bond with, and throughout the film they help each other and teach each other how to see the beauty in their surroundings and not dumb down. Luckily, I think it pulls it off, and by the end it really creates this beautiful and sweet friendship between these two very unlikely companions. The climax of the film is very intense in its subject matter, and I find it to be pulled off pretty well in the way that it incorporates surrealism. It's a very lovely movie and is very underrated, and I think a lot of people will really enjoy it.
I'd have 2 nickels.
The concept of the movie shot entirely in a first person's perspective is something that formerly seemed like a gimmick to me, one that only exists for the sake of the gimmick. That notion I had, that preconceived notion, was completely invalidated by my number 2 pick on this list, Nickel Boys. Not only is Nickel Boys shot entirely in the first person, but it's also edited in one of the strangest and unique and scatterbrained ways I've seen. It feels less like a traditional narrative feature and one like a stream of consciousness, a recollection of memories that have not necessarily happened in the exact order that we're seeing them, and the imagery and the cinematography here is really just so beautiful and absolutely individual. There are so many examples of really unique and interesting shots all throughout this film. Might be speaking on my ass here, I might be completely off my rocker, I might not know what I'm talking about, but it does just feel so groundbreaking, so revolutionary as a movie. And despite how many concepts and ideas this employs and throws at the table, it never gets disorienting or hard to follow in any way. It's constructed in a way that puts you in this almost trance-like state, blurring the lines between filmmaking as a medium to tell a fictional narrative and as a medium to conjure up feelings and emotions and ideas. It's just this masterful balancing act this movie manages to play, telling this beautiful and heart-wrenching story and creating this captivating and experimental style. The story itself follows a black boy growing up in the 1960s and his memories as a young boy growing up under the watch of his grandmother, and more importantly, his life in this reform academy that he goes to as a teenager after he is falsely implicated in a crime that he has no part in. It's a very surface level upsetting and tragic concept for a film, and I mean the movie itself is very tragic, but The way it presents its tragedy and portrays it is not necessarily the way you would expect. For most of the movie, we see the good memories of this school that Elwood has. We see this close friendship he has with another boy, Turner, and the way that they manage to make the most out of their time at the school. Every once in a while something horrific or disturbing will happen, but it's like rarely shown and instead hinted at and implied. The abuse and the mistreatment of this young boy is obviously happening, but it's all occurring behind closed doors and only in the memories of the boys who experienced it. It forever shapes them and who they grow up to be, but outside of them as people, it just never happened. Not because it didn't happen, because it was just so secretive, so untalked about, such a taboo. The final minutes of this movie are some of the most gut-wrenching and utterly devastating moments. It's absolutely horrific and extremely upsetting to witness, but also pretty cathartic in certain ways. Like, yeah, we finally understand the true scope of the horrors that went on at the school, but after nearly 2.5 hours of trying to ignore and suppress this memory, it's like a massive weight is lifted off your chest. It's this really emotional 1-2 punch of an ending. Not enough people are talking about this movie, and someone's got to start. So that someone's going to be me. I'm talking about it right now. I'm telling you, I'm commanding you, in fact, to go watch it. Go watch Nickel Boys, directed by Ramel Ross. Please and thank you.
I pissed my pants.
We have made it to what is far and away my number one pick of the year. The filmmaker is Jane Schoenbrun, who is definitely, the most creative and innovative filmmaker working today, in my opinion. Who's created some of the most hard-hitting and intensely relatable films that deal with themes of societal alienation and otherness, and their most recent film, I Saw the TV Glow, is no different in that regard, while also touching on these same themes and ideas, but also themes of mental barriers that confine us and the inability to accept our true selves. The movie creates a really intoxicating and surreal world to set its story in, one that relies on and manipulates nostalgia to create a reality that both feels like something straight out of a childhood memory, while also feeling not quite right and uncanny in certain ways. Instead of viewing the past through rose-tinted glasses, as most films set in this era do, this film filters it through the ambient pinkish-purple hue of the television set. A stylization that the whole movie takes on, being shot in this really beautiful and unique aesthetic and color palette. It's a very beautiful looking movie that captures the melancholic loneliness, and not through some dark and depressing visual style, but through a style that uses its very striking visuals to elevate the world that this movie creates and lean into the nostalgia of it. A big theme of this movie is about nostalgia, particularly about nostalgia not for real life, but instead for the media that we grew up with. This show becomes not only Owen's, but the movie's itself obsession over its hour and 40-minute runtime. No matter what happens in Owen's life, it always seems to come back to the show and to his relationship to it. This relationship gets called into question multiple times throughout the film, particularly in association with Owen's classmate and friend Maddie, and just what the show itself is. What starts as a very stylized but otherwise fairly normal tale of coming of age in a world where you don't quite fit in transforms into this surreal and at times disturbing cosmic horror. The horror of this movie is not some physical threat that can't be escaped. It exists within the very fabric of the film's reality and within the characters as well. It's quite confusing and hard to fully wrap your head around on a first watch, but the extreme feelings of discomfort this movie invokes are still ever present. On further watches, though, the ideas and themes of the film begin to become clear. This is a movie that is first and foremost about identity and our relationship with our own internal sense of identity and the identity that society expects us to take on. It's a movie about how one can feel trapped in a life they don't want, met with expectations they feel like they cannot meet. It showcases how easy it is to crumble under the pressure and the weight of having to figure yourself out, and how easy it is to refuse to do anything at all and let life just pass you by unchanged. So many communities are relating so heavily to the themes and ideas in this film, and it's really so delightful to see. This is a movie that has really captured, the collective consciousness of society right now, especially in very specific internet communities, specific queer communities and, the trans community even more specifically. It's a beautiful movie with an important message about how fleeting life is and how important it is to truly make the most of it and be your truest self in the little time you still have. Because if you don't make use of that time, it's going to be gone in the blink of an eye. And it's become my favorite film of the year by far. Please put your picks for your favorite movies of the year in the comments below and tell me what you thought of my picks. Please remain civil if you disagreed with me, and if there's a movie you thought deserved to be on this list, please put it down below and I'll tell you what I thought about it if I even saw it. I'm sure there's plenty I missed. I can't watch everything in a given year, but I think I watched the movies that a lot of people were talking about this year and the ones that sounded the most interesting to me. So that's really it, and thanks for watching, and I will see you next time, whenever next time may be.